For over 70 years, the world ran on a simple promise, underwritten by America, a promise of open seas, predictable rules, and shared prosperity. This system, a complex web of alliances and trade routes, created the most interconnected global economy in human history. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. Then, one declaration threatened to tear that map apart. A proposed economic wall that didn't just challenge rivals, but forced America's closest allies into a corner. They were left with a choice: fall in line or build a new world without America at its center. How did the architect of the global economy find itself at risk of being locked out? To understand the earthquake, you first have to appreciate the foundation. The post-war order, led by the United States, was built on the idea that economic integration prevents global conflict. Frameworks like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, and later the World Trade Organization, were the bedrock. For decades, America was the system's anchor and its biggest champion. Allies like Canada and the nations of Europe built their modern economies on this stability. For Canada, it meant becoming more than a neighbor. It became an extension of the U.S. industrial heartland, a partner in a seamless manufacturing ecosystem. For Europe, it meant rebuilding from ashes into a unified economic powerhouse. Trust in the U.S. as a predictable, rules-based leader wasn't just a diplomatic nicety, it was the central gear in the machinery of global commerce. But the cracks began showing long before the latest shockwave. The first Trump administration's sporadic tariffs on steel and aluminum in 2018 were a profound wake-up call. While eventually resolved, the episode planted a seed of strategic doubt in Ottawa and Brussels. The realization dawned: relying so heavily on a single, increasingly unpredictable partner was a critical vulnerability. Quietly, a pivot began. According to data from Statistics Canada, a concerted effort to diversify was already underway. Canada pushed to ratify and implement massive trade pacts with the EU, CETA, and Pacific nations, CPTPP. The EU, meanwhile, began developing what it called strategic autonomy, a policy explicitly designed to reduce its dependence on any single country, including the US, for critical goods like semiconductors and raw materials. This wasn't an act of aggression, but one of self-preservation. It was a strategic shift that meant, when the next, much larger storm arrived, America's allies wouldn't just be better prepared, they would be ready to lead their own way. The proposal that sent shockwaves across the globe was not a single policy, but a strategic trifecta, a fundamental reimagining of America's role in the world. At its core was the 10% universal baseline tariff. As detailed by the Wall Street Journal, the concept was brutally simple: a flat tax on virtually all goods entering the United States, from any country. The official justification was a powerful appeal to fairness, a way to rebalance trade deficits and force other nations to lower their own barriers. The White House framed it as a tool to revitalize American manufacturing and protect the American worker from unfair competition. But economists from across the spectrum, including at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, immediately sounded the alarm. They calculated the move would act as a massive consumption tax, costing the average American household an estimated $1,700 a year, fueling the very inflation it claimed to fight. The second prong of the attack was aimed squarely at Beijing, a proposed tariff of 60% or even higher on all Chinese goods. This was pitched as a necessary cannon blast in a long-running economic war, a way to punish intellectual property theft and force a decoupling from America's chief geopolitical rival. The goal, according to its proponents, was to trigger a mass exodus of manufacturing from China, bringing jobs back to American shores. However, analysis by Bloomberg Economics painted a far grimmer picture, predicting a potential collapse of up to $800 billion in global trade. It warned of a chaotic, expensive scramble for companies to relocate supply chains, creating immense uncertainty and higher costs that would ultimately be passed on to American consumers. The third, and perhaps most disruptive concept, was the reciprocal tax. As The Economist noted, it was an idea with a deceptively simple, almost common-sense appeal. The United States would simply mirror whatever tariff another country placed on an American product. If a country charged a 25% tariff on American cars, the U.S. would automatically impose a 25% tariff on their cars. It was presented as the ultimate fair trade tool. But this ignored the complex, decades-old architecture of global trade agreements, where different countries have different economic structures and negotiated tariff levels. Critics argued it was a recipe for chaos, risking an endless tit-for-tat escalation where trade disputes could spiral out of control with no clear off-ramp. Together, these policies represented more than a shift. They were a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. America was prepared to act as a lone wolf, using its market power as a cudgel to force the world into a new arrangement, whether its allies agreed or not. The reaction from America's allies was not one of panic, but of resolute, calculated defiance. They had seen this storm coming. In Canada, the response was immediate. Having spent years diversifying its trade relationships, Ottawa was no longer negotiating from a position of pure dependency. The groundwork had already been laid. The comprehensive economic and trade agreement with the European Union had already boosted two-way trade, giving Canadian exporters preferential access to a market of 500 million people. The comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership had opened doors to the fast-growing economies of Asia, acting as what one official called a strategic insurance policy. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, the very person who led the grueling negotiations for the updated NAFTA, became the face of this new Canadian resolve. She publicly stressed the importance of building resilient economic relationships around the world, sending a clear message that Canada would not be bullied. Behind the scenes, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau engaged in a diplomatic flurry, reinforcing ties with European leaders. Their conversations centered on accelerating cooperation in future-facing industries, critical minerals, clean energy, and technology, precisely the areas where both Canada and the EU were seeking to reduce their reliance on both China and a potentially protectionist United States. This sentiment was powerfully echoed across the Atlantic. The European Union, guided by its doctrine of open strategic autonomy, activated its own defense mechanisms. This wasn't just talk. As reported by Reuters and the Financial Times, Brussels had a well-oiled machine ready for a trade war. EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis confirmed the bloc had a politically designed retaliation list ready to be deployed. Drawing from their experience during the 2018 tariff battles, this list was engineered to inflict maximum political pain, targeting iconic American products like Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon, exports vital to key political states. More importantly, the EU accelerated its push to finalize trade deals with other major economic blocs like Mercosur in South America, and with nations like India and Australia. The message was unmistakable. If the United States wanted to build walls, Canada and the EU would build bridges with each other and with the rest of the world. For the first time, America's closest friends were not just responding to its actions. They were actively architecting a parallel global trade network, one where Washington was no longer the guaranteed center of gravity. And so, the world arrived at a dangerous stalemate. The United States, convinced of its righteous path to rebalance global trade, had put its cards on the table. It had gambled that the sheer might of its consumer market would force allies to concede. But in doing so, it misread the room. It mistook years of quiet strategic diversification for weakness. Now, it faces a unified front from its oldest friends, who are not only prepared to retaliate, but are actively building a future that is less reliant on American leadership. Canada and the European Union have called the bluff. They have made it clear they will not be passive spectators in the redrawing of the world economic map. This is no longer a simple trade dispute to be hammered out by negotiators. It has become a fundamental clash of visions for the future of globalization. Both sides have dug in, creating a high-stakes confrontation where backing down would mean a massive political and economic loss of face. With no easy exit, the global economy holds its breath, caught in the middle of a family feud with catastrophic potential. This isn't just a story about politicians and policies. It's about livelihoods. Consider a family-owned winery in Ontario's Niagara Peninsula, a business that has spent decades cultivating a reputation for world-class ice wine and Chardonnay. For them, the United States isn't just a market, it's the market, accounting for over 60% of their international sales. Their business model was built on the stability of the cross-border relationship, but a sudden 10% tariff changes the entire equation overnight. Their premium wine, already competing in a crowded U.S. market, instantly becomes 10% more expensive for American distributors and consumers. This isn't a hypothetical. During previous, smaller tariff disputes, they saw their U.S. orders dry up by nearly a third. A universal tariff would be catastrophic. Their American importers who work on thin margins would be forced to either absorb the cost, which is unlikely, or find a cheaper alternative from another country not subject to the new tax. For the winery, this means a devastating loss of revenue. It jeopardizes plans for expansion, threatens the jobs of their full-time staff, and devalues decades of investment in building a brand south of the border. And they aren't alone. From auto parts makers in Windsor to lumber mills in British Columbia, the story is the same. The threat of tariffs creates a chilling effect, forcing Canadian businesses to question the viability of their most important trading relationship and wonder if the foundation of their prosperity is built on sand. The diversification that leaders talk about in Ottawa is, for them, a desperate and expensive race against time. But that economic pain doesn't stop at the border. It boomerangs right back. Just a few thousand miles away, a celebrated farm-to-table restaurant in Austin, Texas, faces its own version of the crisis. The chef has built her reputation on sourcing the absolute best ingredients. Her famous pork chop comes from a specific heritage farm in rural Quebec, prized for its quality. Her seafood specials often rely on fresh scallops and lobster shipped overnight from Nova Scotia. For her, North America is a single integrated pantry. The proposed 10% tariff, combined with the inevitable Canadian retaliation, creates a nightmare. Suddenly, the cost of her key ingredients jumps. The Quebec pork is 10% more expensive. And in response to U.S. actions, Canada might place its own retaliatory tariff on American goods, making it harder for the Texan beef she also serves to be sold up north, hurting her own local suppliers. She faces a terrible choice: absorb the higher costs and watch her razor-thin profit margins vanish, or raise her menu prices and risk alienating loyal customers already struggling with inflation. It's the exact scenario American business groups warned about. The ultimate cost of the trade dispute isn't paid by foreign governments, but by American small business owners and consumers. The policy designed to protect America first ends up punishing the very entrepreneurs who form the backbone of the U.S. economy, proving that in a deeply integrated world, there's no such thing as a one-way economic wall. And so, North America, and indeed the Western world, stands at a crossroads forged by its own architect. A 70-year partnership built on mutual trust and shared prosperity is now threatened by a fundamental disagreement over the path forward. The United States, seeking to reclaim its industrial might, risks alienating its most steadfast allies and isolating itself from the very global system it created. Canada and Europe, once reliable followers, are now charting their own course, driven by a new strategic necessity. The path of mutual reliance has fractured. What replaces it is an uncertain confrontation where the cost of going it alone could be catastrophic for everyone. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both sides lose trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.